I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to Season 4 of the Innkeepers podcast.
Yes, we are so glad that you are here with us again, listening and learning about missions and its many facets and how we can care for our missionaries.
It's been fun to think back of the guests that we've had in the first 3 seasons.
Yeah, there's been a lot of amazing guests and so much wisdom. And so we are just really thrilled that today we are interviewing Dennis Beck and Mark Downing.
Well, tell us a little bit about Mark Downing.
Yes, so in full disclosure, Mark Downing is my dad. And he and my mom, Helen, served as missionaries in Brazil for 26 years. You'll hear a little bit more of his story as we get into our interview with them. But we invited him and Dennis to be on our podcast today because my dad just has always been really savvy about money and wise in investing, and just thought that he could really contribute to today's conversation.
Yeah, and Dennis is someone, you'll know his name from Season 1 when we talked to Dennis and Kasia and about their story and their ministry in Poland with Crusade. And now Dennis, his main or primary ministry isn't finances with Cru, but he's getting a lot of financial inquiries and he's been able to do a lot of financial coaching from people preparing to go to the mission field to people approaching retirement age. And so he's in, just not by choice, but God has given him great ministry there in his own organization. So he has a lot of really great things to share today.
So we hope you really are encouraged and challenged to think about this topic of finances and retirement today, and perhaps just have an opportunity to grow in this area. I'm so glad to have you guys here on our podcast today. I would love it if you, Dennis Beck and Mark Downing, could introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your journey in missions and your movement towards retirement as we talk about retirement, finances, and missions today. Who would like to start?
We sensed we were school teachers 6 years out of college. Back then we were called DINKs. Double income, no kids. And we sensed that God wanted more of our lives than just faithful laymen at church. We applied to teach at a school for missionary kids in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And we went there expecting to stay many years, but because of the political situation in 1975, 6 and 7 in Ethiopia, the school closed. And we returned to the United States. But that changed us. In some circles, they would call that our short-term experience. And it really changed us, and we went to seminary to hone our skills and have 3 kids and get ready. And God called us to Brazil. We went there in 1985, studied Portuguese, and started teaching in seminary in the middle of the country in a city called Campo Grande. I started teaching Greek and New Testament courses, all in Portuguese, and we did that there for about 10 years. I opened every class by reading from the book Operation World, which is a prayer guide. And so many of my students were coming to me saying God had called them to missions. What should they do? And so I came back to Portland, got a little bit retooled, working on a DMIS, and went back and started a missions degree at the seminary. Did that for 5 years until the head of the Brazilian Baptist Convention Board of World Missions invited us to move to Rio and help them launch their World Missions Training Center. And Helen, my wife, and I did that. Our nest was empty at that time, and we moved to Rio, stayed there as coordinators of the World Missions Training Center for another 10 years until we retired in the end of 2011. We came back to Vancouver. 2 of our 3 kids were there at the time. Be careful about following your kids. They don't stay put. There's still one around here though.
Great, thank you. Dennis?
Well, I had a slightly different journey. I came as a faculty member. I was a professor at Cal Poly State University, where I got involved with Campus Crusade for Christ, now branded as Cru in the United States. Started traveling in the summers to then communist Poland and working again behind the Iron Curtain in the summers, taking students from my campus, 10 of them, the second year in 1980. Then the Lord got a hold of me and said, somebody else can be teaching horticulture. I want you to go to Poland. And so it was the question of the interpreter we had the summer of 1979, who was there at Cal Poly learning how to be a new staff member with Cru underground. And my wife was training her, and she said to me, Dennis, what's keeping you from coming to my country? And when I thought about it, I realized my excuses were pretty lame. And the Lord and I had it out today writing my test on a Saturday or a Sunday, and the rest is history. We moved there about the same time Mark did. In 1983, martial law was going on at that time, and learned language. The most difficult intellectual challenge I ever had was learning Polish. And 2 years later, I was offered to teach there. And so I taught at the Agriculture Academy, which was my cover for being there. And so a few years later, the wall falls. 6 months later, my wife is returning from the United States with our 2 very small kids and dies 8 hours afterwards, of which both Steve and Kara have taken a podcast earlier on, so you'd have to go see that somewhere else. But so the life changed. And so now, instead of working with students as I had been in the first years, all of a sudden with the wall falling, we had 46 Polish staff underground, and we had to figure out how to bring them above ground because now the wall had fallen, and things like taxation and health benefits, retirement, all these kinds of questions came into play. And so I took on an organizational administrative type of role and got married to our best friend. And, now we have 3 kids, and we spent essentially 38 years entirety living outside of the country. The last 8, half time traveling over to the country, whereas the first 30 years for me and 37 for my wife had been living in Eastern Europe. And that's how we met Steve and his wife and family.
Wow. Well, so there is a lot of experience you both have had on the field, and just seeing different missionaries in their journey, they have overlapped with yours. So thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to this conversation. Know that you each bring your own perspective to this topic. Steve?
Yeah. So early on, when you guys were raising support and planning, and I know, Mark, you and your wife were planning on being in Ethiopia long term, as long as God kept the door open. And Dennis, I don't know how, what it looked like for you in the very beginning when you first went to Poland, but somewhere along the way, there had to be a discussion about, okay, what does the mission require of you or ask of you as you look towards the future to prepare for yourselves, for you and your wife, for you and your families, how to take care of your families. What kinds of things were in place at that point? Dennis, let's start. Was there anything specifically required of you?
No, but they said that we had the opportunity to raise support and then contribute it to what is known as a 403B and for nonprofits and that type of thing. And it's a way to put money aside. But starting in 1996 is when the Roth Ira came out, and living overseas and not being taxed the same way people in the US, I saw it to be a gold mine to put, at that point, only $2,000 a year into a program. And a Roth, basically, anytime you see the word Roth, it just means contributions go in after they're taxed, but all the earnings and those contributions come out in retirement totally tax-free. And that, to me, was a no-brainer, having slight financial head at that time. And so I have faithfully done that all but 1 year, put in the maximum amount. So my encouragement would be obviously to at least start there if an organization is not doing it, or if a person's not doing it, but put what you can away. We'll get into the biblical principles afterwards.
Sure. Okay, Mark.
Every missionary's experience is different. Dennis came from a large church. I have been supported by a mega church. And so the experiences that we share there are going to be different than so many missionaries on the field who come from smaller churches. We went with an agency, a denomination of our church that had a pension plan, a 403B. When you're young, you don't really think about that too much. But boy, being retired, I am so glad that we were forced to raise funds to contribute to that pension plan. And not only did it have a pension plan, it had two parts. It had a part that was required to be put in, and another part that you could put in as much as you want every year. And those, during our last decade in Rio de Janeiro with no kids at home, and we kind of had finished helping them through college, we lived on very little. It was our opportunity to put away more than half of our income every month into our pension plan.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time we were done, we had quite a nest egg. And that meant that we had to live on very little. We lived on little, and Dave Ramsey would say, live like no one else so that you can live like no one else. And what he means by that is you live on beans and rice, and you don't go out to eat, and you save, and you put money away, and you don't live extravagantly, so that later you can be generous. And so now in this period of our lives, we can live generously. And that's what we're doing.
Well, I know just in our experience, my wife and I, our family, I mean, we've been involved in pretty much full-time Christian service for most of the 40 years we've been married. And at some point, there were things in place for us retirement-wise, and sometimes there weren't. And I know that I'm not very aggressive when it's been coming to savings. It's just one of those things we feel like we've done what God has asked us to do, and we just continue to trust him. And I did want to just bring into the mix the whole idea. I have a close family member that they went overseas as brethren missionaries, and in their experience and the life of the brethren, there's just literally no discussion about money. It's like God's going to provide, God will care for you. And so that's a whole nother tradition where the finances just, it's really up to the individual missionaries to care for themselves and care for their families. Have you run into, conversations or run into people that just like, oh, this is not something I'm going to talk about?
I have in the context of doing personal finance counseling that I have done over the years, absolutely enjoy it. But in getting to see other mission organizations, and how they work and so forth, there is, even within organizations, there is that idea that, well, in retirement, God is going to take care of us. And that is true.
Yeah.
That is absolutely true. He is going to take care of us. But there are different options that he can provide that care that include taking the message of the ant in Proverbs 6, I think it is the instruction of the ant: be wise and watch what the ant does. It stores it away. Joseph did the same thing in Egypt, and therefore saved his family from the famine. So the idea of putting something aside for another day, the idea of delayed gratification is really what Mark's referring to there. And I support that wholeheartedly. And teaching my children was a passion to help them understand the idea of learning to live within their means or with less than their means, and putting money aside besides giving.
So how about we shift into this question of what are some of the biblical principles that have guided each of you as you have looked towards finances in your life?
Well, I think the first principle is have no debt. That helps so much in what you can do if you have no debt. You're not a slave to the lender. And that's what Proverbs will tell us. The borrower is slave to the lender. And if we live on credit cards with more than 18% charging you in interest payments, it's you're in slavery, and that accumulates and can bury you. And I think that can happen to missionaries as well. Learn to live on less than your income. I think the first principle that I would say is live on less than you make.
Okay.
And put away. We started by 10%, but it has grown over the years to over 20%. So it can happen if you start by not being a slave to a lender. So that's the first principle, I'd say.
Okay.
And I would guess that having debt would be affecting people not only on the retirement end, but also as they're trying to raise support. If they are still in a lot of debt and thinking about heading to the missions field, that can be a barrier to being able to leave.
Well, school debt sure is for many candidates for missions. If they have thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s in school debt, they don't go.
I know we've had some conversations kind of off the record with people about how when they're interviewing people that are interested in going overseas, that right now, before they even start raising support, there's almost sometimes 3 to 5 years of kind of just working with them to get them into a place where they're ready to start raising support, because it takes that much time to just really get them to the place where they're ready to begin raising support. And a lot of that is just dealing with school debt and other things.
That's certainly one of the generational differences between what Mark and I have experienced versus the younger generations. This idea of school debt is just, obviously a snare and so forth. So yes, it does keep people off the field. I think another principle is understanding that God owns it all. That nothing I have is my own. I'm actually just a steward of it, and I can lose it. I can lose part of it. I can gain more of it. And I think Mark alluded to this as you go on and as you get older. 2 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 to 19 talks about becoming a more generous giver. And I'm actually enjoying that part. That's one of my spiritual gifts, is giving. And I've just enjoyed this period, giddy over things. And again, not to draw attention to myself, but just the idea that I have that freedom at this point to be able to give it away to God's work and to help concrete people with concrete needs. And whether I get a tax deduction or not, who cares? Because I don't even claim them, you know. So that's another thing. And I totally support, as we said, the debt. And the idea is whatever you do invest in is you want to diversify. You want to kind of, is make sure it's spread across what we call risk asset classes and that type of thing. But that's getting into the weeds. But the idea is diversity becomes your friend. And then the other thing is just an 80-20 principle. God talks very clearly about tithe in the Old Testament, a tenth. But as he moves into the New Testament and part of God's revealing thing, we get this word cheerful giver, and I believe it's Corinthians. And God loves a cheerful giver. And the idea of it's more than, I believe, 10%, as we've just already been saying. And the idea that it's to expand. But taught my kids 10% you give away to God, 10% you put in a separate envelope that is your savings for whatever reason, and the other 80% you have the discretion how you spend it. And so that's something I live by, at least that 80-20 principle.
I'd like to capitalize on two things that Dennis said. Number one is that money is not the goal. It is a resource. God's glory is the goal. And so we see money as a resource, and he gives it to us to administer. It belongs to him, but it's our privilege to administer. And the second thing I'd say is an important principle is that God is generous. He is a generous God. And he wants us to live generously. And I think that if we start with those two principles, that gives us a foundation on which we can build lots of nitty-gritty.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, this is talking about how we're image bearers, that we want to reflect what God is like to people around us. And we know that God is a generous God. And as he gives us resources, we can be generous if we're living wisely.
So I know Proverbs is very clear and often cited and referred to in terms of planning for the future, observe the ant, be diligent, and so on. And I don't have any disagreement with that. It's obviously scripture. But then maybe some people jump to the New Testament and they jump to Matthew 6 and they say, take no thought for tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Just what's the balance if you run into someone and just like, oh, I don't have to worry about the future at all. How do you kind of approach a conversation like that with someone to try to kind of help them find a better perspective?
As long as they're not using the second part you just said, Steve, as an excuse for not having planned, and being lazy or being, in this sense, disobedient to something they think God may have instructed them to do. Putting that aside, there are people that believe that way, and God will provide. He just won't provide the same way. He's going to provide perhaps for someone who planned a little differently.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a plan to plan or a plan not to plan. I've met all sorts of people. I don't condemn anyone that's put the other side, but I haven't met anybody who has planned say they are like Mark said at the beginning, are not happy that they did plan. It gives them a lot of opportunities, both for covering health expenses and covering for, end of life issues that tend to creep in there. So, and plus it's the other part of leaving a legacy. a financial legacy to your church, your mission, your children, wherever else you want to invest it.
So what would you guys think might be some of the role of an agency or a church? Is the responsibility solely on the missionary, or does the church or agency have any responsibility in this and helping their missionaries think about these issues and plan?
Well, I think the ultimate answer to that question lies with the missionary. And if the missionary goes with an agency that doesn't plan for your retirement, then you need to do it. I think it's better if you're with an agency that helps you plan for that, but not all of them do.
Mm-hmm.
So the ultimate responsibility for you and your family, your dependence upon God, comes from you. And I know missionaries who have been with agencies who didn't have a plan, and they didn't plan, and they retired with nothing. God takes care of them, as Dennis said, but in different ways. And those who have had a plan, and even though their agency has not provided for their planning, for their retirement, these people took it on themselves and created their own plan with their IRAs or whatever, savings and investments, and have been able to retire and take care of their needs.
I was sobered in my 30s, meeting one of my pastors of the home church I grew up in, who came into Ecuador right after Nate Saint and the Elliott, the murders there by the Aka Indians and so forth. And he was there just after them in the 53, 54 period. He came back to our church and he said to me in his late 50s or early 60s, he said to me, I said, "So when do you plan to retire?" He said, "I can never retire." I said, "What do you mean you can never retire?" And to me, by the way, when I use the word retire, I mean I stop taking a paycheck.
Okay.
I don't stop ministering, but I stop taking a paycheck. And he said, "I can never do it because I've never planned. My missionary organization didn't have this type of a plan set up for us. I have to work." Mm-hmm. And guess what? The church forced him out of his job at the age of 90. 90.
Wow.
And so he was not the head pastor. He was the pastor of visitation and so forth and so forth. And so this was a sobering moment for me as a 30-something-year-old visiting with him. So.
Yeah, all our decisions have consequences. And I think this conversation is helpful just to even think about, okay, what are the consequences of my decision? If I plan to not plan, those will be consequences. And if I plan to plan and have a retirement savings, the outcomes will be different.
And definitely our understanding of Scripture, Cara and I were talking about this the other day, and the way our understanding of Scripture is going to dictate everything in this area. And if you really truly believe that it's not your responsibility, that God is going to care for you and I just don't have to plan, I'll just keep living my life. If you really believe that that's what Scripture teaches, then that's the way you're going to move forward. And if you otherwise, you'll move forward with a different plan.
Yeah. And God allows us to have those choices.
Some of the older missionaries, one that was with Sudan Interior Missions, she was just around 50 when I met her, and I was late 20s, early 30s when I was teaching, and befriended her and got to hear her story after 26 years. She said her mission would take care of her in retirement, and they did. And so she lived into her 90s, and she was still being cared by her denomination. That was a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
She didn't work with them, after those first 26 years. She started a Bible bookstore and so forth. But, the point is, she had that opportunity to go into their home. I don't have that opportunity. Never was promised anything like that other than participating in a pension plan, contributing to a 403B, which, by the way, our organization contracted with an insurance company to take our 403B money, and it went bankrupt. And it took us 10 years to get a little bit of the money back out of it. So there's also that kind of thing.
Sure.
Everybody had good intentions, but it just didn't work out. And so then the third thing, as I always say, is you always can fall back on the individual retirement arrangements, which are called IRAs. And in this case, for those overseas, you probably aren't paying net tax. You sure aren't in the US if you take the foreign income exclusion, but you can invest that money post-tax if your paycheck's coming out of the US, post-tax, and never pay another dime of tax ever.
Yeah.
It's going in and coming out. And that's a no-brainer. And then later going after a Roth Ira or a Roth 403B or something if they offer it.
But it's all important. We've kind of touched on some generational differences, and it's probably, we talked about the school debt and people getting ready, but also something too that we see is that people are less inclined to, sign up for a life commitment kind of. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this for 3 to 5 years, 7 to 10 years maybe, and then I'm going to go do something else. And so maybe they have the thing, oh, once I get settled in something else, then I'll start doing the savings. Let's talk about a little bit about generational differences and philosophies as people think about saving.
I don't know if it's all totally generational. When I went to Poland, I told them I was going to be there 5 years. I had the world to conquer at that point. I had my plans, but God had his own. When my wife dies, I'm still a supported missionary in my late 60s. And now I'm making plans to stay possibly to 70, 72. My point is it's about a paycheck. And so staying with it there. So I can relate a little bit to the generational thing. If they're saying this is just a missionary experience, the Mormon Church does that. They try to get everybody in for 2 years, to experience it and so forth. I get that. But there's a sense within the younger generations, I think, I'm going to have multiple jobs in my life. I'm not just going with one organization, which is more or less the model that Mark and I grew up on, and or at least our parents had. And so we didn't move around. There wasn't the opportunities to move around, the flexibility. And so I think that is inherent in the current generations coming up, but that's fine as long as they become lifelong workers for the kingdom. If they gathered that and grasp onto that we're not on this earth to fulfill our own self-actualizations, quoting Maslow, but we're here to actually, be workers in the kingdom. They can still be God's workers in the workplace. I don't have a problem with that. I just got off a call with professors that I work with, and they were discussing Tim Keller's book on that, on being in the marketplace. And so anyway, enough said there.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
When Jesus said in Matthew 6, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, he also said, do store up for yourself treasures in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we forget that part. We need to make sure that the way we store up for ourselves treasures in heaven isn't just financial. It's also spiritual.
Yeah.
It's both and. And I think that will help us keep all these other things in perspective. And we get into the nitty gritty of finances. We got to see really what we're doing. We have a kingdom that Jesus is building his church, and he wants us involved in it. And so how do we do that both spiritually and financially? I think is a question that I look at all the time. To what you're saying about maybe I'm referring to what Dennis said. Some of the nitty gritty of how to do it financially is going to be different for everyone.
Sure.
Whether you can do the 2080 thing or have Dave Ramsey's envelopes for how to get out of debt, or it's going to be different for everyone. But you need to submit to what Jesus wants you to do and follow the Bible. There's so many things, not just in Proverbs, but in the New Testament, with biblical principles about how to live financially. People of some groups, so-called faith groups, don't want to talk about finances when the New Testament talks more about finances than it does about heaven and hell. It's so important to understand as believers what God says about finances and to live his way about finances.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I think one of the biggest blessings, and as I look at our, the money that we've had the opportunity to give away, I mean, God gives us money and then we, take care of our needs, but we have the opportunity to give money away, to give money to other organizations and individuals and support. Just like people have supported us for years, we have the opportunity to join in with other people that are early on in the journey of beginning this, their ministry and mission. And so we can jump in and be part of that. And that's a great thing that we can do. And once you retire, to be able to continue that, at least to some extent, is going to be a huge blessing to others, as well as you're advancing the kingdom of God through the work of other people.
A couple other things that I would add to that, if you will allow me, is one is in this whole discussion about church and age differences and so forth, there's an underlying thought sometimes about worldly, that talking about money is a worldly thing. And I don't think it is. It's just a neutral instrument.
Yeah.
And so that, if we take it out of that worldly sanctity versus sanctified kind of thing, is important. I think another thing is people grow up feeling that somebody else is going to take care of me.
Okay. Yeah.
And the idea that, and it was so funny that in 1993, I think it was, the wall had fallen in communist Poland, and I'm with my staff now, about 80 of them, and I'm talking to them about, setting some money aside, and that we're going to actually start taking some of their support they're raising and put aside a meager amount for the retirement, because as a religious order there in Poland, the amount of money that was contributed to the official retirement system, the equivalent of Social Security in the United States, was minuscule. And so what were they going to have in it? So just trying to even get them to do that was a big hill to climb. And I asked them, who did your parents think was going to take care of them? The government, because everybody in communism, the government was going to take care of you from cradle to grave in communism.
Right. Yeah.
Well, communism's fall, so who's going to take care of them now? Well, I guess we are, the sons and daughters.
Yeah.
Said, right. So now who's going to take care of you as young staff persons? Oh, Campus Crusade for Christ. And I said, well, I got news for you. And that's the conversation we had. So there's always the idea that somebody else is going to take care of me. And that part that goes back into the planning or non-planning kind of thing. And as long as we keep that all straight, I think that's another aspect to it.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Well, we have certainly just kind of skimmed over the surface here.
We scratched the surface, just barely.
But it's a great conversation, and I hope it's the conversation, as people listen to this, will motivate them to look at their own, where they are financially, what's going on, but also if they're caring for missionaries or part of a team that's supporting or encouraging missionaries, that they'll be not afraid to ask them questions, what's going on. And as I move into the last question about things that my resources, Dennis holds up a book. So if you just take a minute to share some resources that could be helpful for people going forward. Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, Ron Blue was the master in the generation before was managing your master your money, was probably influential in me in understanding what I was even trying to do with planning and money and so forth. So just one resource. I know Mark mentioned Dave Ramsey and so forth, and I think all of those are totally supported.
Okay.
Yeah, and he has a book. Ron Blue has one, Raising Money Smart Kids, and that was the best thing, is because I was interested that my kids would avoid some of the pitfalls. So anyway, 2 resources.
In my Christian experience, Ron Blue was the one who started my thinking about these things. But then along came Dave Ramsey and his Total Money Makeover, or Financial Peace University. These were big influences on my life. Randy Alcorn contributed to with a book called Money, Possessions, and Eternity. Those resources have been very influential in how I viewed money as a resource, that God owned it, and he's letting us administer it. And we have to administer it the way the Bible talks about.
Yeah. I think it's so helpful to stop and think about how money is really neutral. And we are given the opportunity to steward it. And the choices, God, it's part of our free will that we get to choose how to steward the money that comes through our hands and what we do with that. But the Bible does teach about it. So to seek out and learn, what does the Bible teach about this? Because I think there's a huge vacuum in our churches and even in the missions community of thoroughly talking through what the consequences of our decisions are with regards to money. And so I think it's really helpful to hear both of you that are older and wiser, who have lived this and are already in kind of your retirement years, or getting closer to them. You've benefited from the decisions you made. But one last little question: is there anything you would change in what you did, or are you completely satisfied with what you did, with how you approached saving up for retirement?
No, I think the only thing I could say is I wish I could have influenced more people to consider some of these principles earlier on, instead of just being silent and going about my own plan, kind of personalizing it versus helping others. And when that door opened to me about 15, 20 years ago, it's amazing. I have the blessing of watching people get out of bondage and at the same time also thrive and are getting into a position where they can retire. And so I'm even doing seminars and in my own organization with the unique things that we have, over that. But it's just the idea of, I'm passionate about helping people. And I just, you guys decide, but here are the principles, and how might that look in your situation?
You're able to function in the role of a mentor for other people. And I think a lot of us haven't had that financial mentorship. I would say that I never really did in my life. And so I'm grateful, Dennis, that you have that opportunity. Mark, is there anything you want to add?
I'd add to what Dennis said. I think my regret is not being able to influence more people in the same financial way Dennis and I have been talking about. I remember listening to Dave Ramsey when we lived in Rio, talking about you live like no one else now so that you can live like no one else later.
Mhm.
And I remember that we thought about that in relation to colleagues who were spending all the money that came in and more, and we were not doing that, and thinking what they're going to face in the future, and wishing I would have taken the opportunity to talk to them about thinking more about their future. And I know that today some of them are suffering those consequences.
Well, today you both have had a voice out there in the world on our podcast. So thank you for your time and your investment in sharing what you have learned with our audience. I really hope that it reaches people and allows them to consider and ask questions and research and learn and study for themselves.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much. We are really grateful for your time here on our podcast this morning. Well, Cara, tell me something you heard today.
Yeah, I really was encouraged at how both Dennis and my dad were very pleased, I think, with the decisions they made, and that they didn't have any regrets with saving and being able to be generous in their later years. I mean, my dad is practically 75 years old, and Dennis is in his later 60s, right? And they both invested well and now are doing well in their closer to retirement years or in retirement. And I think the inverse isn't always true, that those who haven't planned to plan, you know, like we talked about, God takes care of them. But I think there's often a lot of angst and just struggle in those years. And so it just was challenging to me because I know that this is the area that my husband and I need to grow in. Yeah. So I'm really just challenged to pursue planning a little better.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think they both made it really clear that that's not about accumulating a lot of wealth.
Yeah.
But it is planning for the future, being able to take care of yourself and your family, and being able to have money to give away, because generosity is a great thing. And when you have the opportunity to support God's ongoing ministry, you really are storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven, and that is a responsibility that Scripture gives us is to store up treasures in heaven.
Yeah, I feel like that eternal perspective, if we keep that in mind, it really will impact how we use our resources.
Yeah. And Dennis was very honest that at one point they had set aside some money through his organization, and that the people in charge of stewarding that money went bankrupt. They basically lost all their money. And so we can plan and we can do everything that we think we should do, but ultimately God is absolutely in control of it.
Yeah, he's still dependent on him.
Yeah, completely dependent, because there are people that have literally lost their life savings because of someone else's misdeeds or some kind of unforeseen circumstance. And so they have done everything they could do, but then in the end, they didn't have the resources they thought they were going to have.
Yeah, so it's really important to remember that we have God to be dependent on ultimately, but he's asking us to steward what he gives us.
Yeah. And I think it's, I don't know. I feel like the family I was raised in, there was a lot of fear around money, and there weren't a lot of conversations, like no conversations about how to handle money and how to plan. And I feel like I haven't done, when we were raising our kids, I feel like I just didn't have a really solid base to pass financial things on to them. And so I regret that. I regret that there wasn't more open conversation about that. But the fact that we seek to be as generous as we can with the resources that we do have, and as wise as we can with what God has given us. But I know that we're as we age, we're just continuing to look to God for his provision.
Yeah. So we hope that this podcast today just would open that conversation door for you. Maybe it's something that hasn't been discussed in your family or with your church or with your mission agency, and we just really encourage you to have that conversation.
Yeah, and if you are in a position where you're overseeing or caring for missionaries, I hope that this can maybe be an open door or a way just to talk and just encourage them as they plan for their future.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.